Good evening and welcome. Thank you all for joining us for today's discussion. My name is Craig Kafura. I'm the Director for Public Opinion and Foreign Policy Research here at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. We're here tonight to talk trade. The US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, known here in the US as USMCA, faces its first formal review next year. Since going into effect in 2020, the USMCA, which updated and replaced the original NAFTA, has maintained lower trade barriers between Mexico, Canada, and the United States. This agreement facilitates approximately $2 trillion worth of trade every year, an anchor in an ever-changing global trade landscape. And Americans see the value. Per a recent Chicago Council survey conducted just last month, 3 in 4 Americans say that the USMCA is good for the US economy. And most Americans say that trade with Canada and Mexico is good for US national security. However, recent upheavals to US trade policy and the sweeping tariffs placed on US trade partners have left the future of the agreement unclear. And in response, Mexico and Canada are recalibrating not just their economic relationships, but their strategic positioning. And what began as an agreement built on trust and for regional integration now faces questions about leverage and the future of rules-based frameworks in an era of more transactional diplomacy. In times like these, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs provides a space to discuss the challenges, the opportunities, and the uncertainties of the changing global order. And tonight, we are fortunate to have experts bring perspectives from all 3 countries to help us understand what's at stake and what comes next. We are incredibly grateful to Heather Hurlburt, Eric Miller, and Orlando Pérez for joining us tonight for this discussion, moderated by the University of Chicago's own Robert Gárate. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage.
Good evening. Hi. All right, thanks to Craig for the introductory remarks. And thank you all for joining us today. My name is Robert Gárate, and I'm an associate professor of political science at the University of Chicago. And we're really pleased to have 3 experts from, again, different perspectives on the issue of the USMCA. We have Heather Hurlburt, who is currently the Associate Fellow at the Chatham House and previously served as the Chief of Staff to USTR, Catherine Tai. Before that, she founded New America's New Models of Policy Change Project and held senior positions at the International Crisis Group and Human Rights First. And representing more the Canadian perspective, we have Eric Miller, president of the Rideau Potomac Strategy Group, where he advises on trade, economic policy, and North American relations. Eric serves on Canada's External Advisory Committee on International Trade Policy, has advised 40 governments and worked on 6 free trade agreements. And finally, on my far left is Orlando Pérez Gárate, partner at Tsuru, specializing in international trade law and dispute resolution, and drawing on 2 decades of experience with Mexico's Undersecretary of Foreign Trade. Orlando is Mexico's lead negotiator on the key USMCA provisions, including intellectual property and state-owned enterprises. So we're going to start off this program with a discussion based off questions that I have for the various panelists, and then at some point we'll open up to audience Q&A and Q&A from the online audience. But before we begin, please hold your questions for that time when I open up the Q&A for that portion of the program. And for those of you who are joining virtually, you can submit your questions online at ccga.live. And again, I would like to remind everyone that today's program is on the record. Any views expressed by the speakers or myself here at the Council are their own and do not represent either the Council or any institutional positions. Okay. So with that sort of air clearing, I would like to begin with a series of questions for our esteemed panelists. So I want to set us up a little bit because this topic can be very technical sometimes, and I want to make sure that we're kind of thinking about it appropriately. So comparing where we are now to when NAFTA was negotiated in 1990, we can see ourselves in a fairly different position. Back then, most US trade with, let's say, Canada was duty-free, right? And so what we're talking about was opening up a few key sectors. The auto sector had been basically integrated across North America since the 1960s. So we've already had basically open trade in that sector at that time. NAFTA helped solidify a factory North America and bolster the industries in the face of competition, not from China, but from Japan, was the major concern at the time, especially for the auto sector, and led to a reinvigorated global trade system, including, and it was happening in a context where we were also developing global institutions like the WTO, which was negotiated around the same time during the Uruguay round. So that was like when NAFTA was invented. And now we have to think back to another time of a key moment in this relationship, which was in 2017. So in 2017, the cracks in the WTO had become chasms. The organization had already become irrelevant. And the aborted Trans-Pacific Partnership was roundly rejected for various political reasons. And under the first Trump administration, shockwaves were sent through the international trade regime and across the world because he was using a shift from the sort of push on multilateralism to a push on bilateralism, country-to-country negotiations. In that context, it seemed quite striking that despite this commitment to bilateralism, he nonetheless managed through the course of the first term to renegotiate and complete the USMCA. So the idea was that it would improve competitiveness of the US vis-a-vis China and North America, and it stood as a kind of a bright spot in otherwise a challenging period for global cooperation. Today, we face, I would say, a very different world, right? After April 2nd, Independence Day tariffs, there's fundamentally different stakes if you leave NAFTA, the new NAFTA 2.0 now versus when you would leave it in the 1990s. At the same time, we're also left wondering how valuable any agreement can be in this context, given the principles and the interests of the current American administration, which seems unconstrained by past commitments. So I want to open my discussion to a question to Orlando, which is, what role do you see for a regional agreement like the USMCA in the broader context of trade agreements in this context?
Thank you so much. And first of all, thank you to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs for the lovely invitation and to participate with all of you in this interesting session. I think that the USMCA as a trade agreement has in some way changed the landscape of trade rules. We are coming from a period of time where security and predictability in the trade rules-based system from the WTO has changed. In some way has changed because the reality or some different views on how the trade needs to advance in the future, particularly from the US, in some way has changed the way that the trade deals needs to be written. In fact, if you see, there was one of the example is that when we were in the negotiation, for example, the US maintained that it will be difficult for them to put a name that says free trade agreement or trade cooperation agreement. Now they call it trade reciprocal agreement. So in some way they are changing the vision on how to deal with the trade agreements. And my perception is that industries now are adjusting their practices to the new reality in a more pragmatic way, because they know that the rules could be changed in the near future. No? So I will say that basically this new agreement perhaps has served as a model for some provisions, particularly provisions related to digital trade, services and investment, intellectual property, state-owned enterprises that are perhaps new types of provisions. And in terms of tariffs or trading goods, I think that they have shifted the point of view to create a free trade area or and in a more rhetorical way to try to deal with the imbalances in the bilateral trade. I think this is the way that they have to understand this agreement. And now I think that during the review of the USMCA, perhaps we will see more other type of provisions or decisions to be included in the rules that deals with the reality that we are facing in 2025. No.
Yes, I wanted to talk about that review period. So one of the reasons we're meeting here today is because the USMCA has a review process, which is going to be occurring in the next year or so. And the review can result in extending the USMCA to 2042, or it could lead to a sunset in 2036, which means that it would go away. In some ways, this review process is somewhat superfluous, as the NAFTA agreement already had a withdrawal provision. At any time, countries can submit a warning in 6 months in advance and withdraw from the agreement. Any country can do that. And that provision is still present in the USMCA. But I wanted to ask, and this can be a question for Eric, what role do you see in particular for the review process? Does it change the negotiating dynamic to have a review process? And how did you see the review process that was introduced in this agreement before the Trump administration used it for the purposes it's using it now?
Yeah, the review process, from my perspective, is enormously important. It's something that keeps uncertainty alive year after year after year. Essentially, what you are looking at is if they do not extend the agreement for 15 years in July of 2026, then you have annual review processes for 10 years. Now, you have to think about how Donald Trump views trade agreements versus how other presidents have. There was, yes, indeed, a withdrawal provision in the original NAFTA, but there was no sense that Barack Obama, George W. Bush, Bill Clinton were ever going to use that provision. It was there so that there was an exit, but nobody would use it. Donald Trump, when he looks at trade, he sees other countries principally as counterparties. They're not allies or friends, they're counterparties because this is a commercial negotiation, and he, being trained in the hard-knuckle world of New York real estate, knows that commercial negotiations mean one party wins and one party loses from his perspective. And so this review process provides leverage in that each year you can come back and ask for a little more. One of the great unanswered questions right now is what are the relationships between USMCA and the bilateral agreements that the U.S. is negotiating with Canada and with Mexico. And so you've seen in the bilateral agreements a great deal of demands from the United States on digital services tax and other sorts of measures. And we don't know how that fits into the bigger USMCA picture. But Donald Trump is very good at driving toward concessions from others. And so this becomes another tool for him to achieve that objective.
I want to ask Heather if you agree that this review process gives particular negotiating leverage to the president.
So I think we can sometimes overemphasize the particularities of President Trump here. And if we do that, we miss some of the broader trends in U.S. society in particular, but not just U.S. society that helped us get here. And President Trump was not the only fan of that review provision in the USMCA renegotiations, Orlando. And I suspect that if we had a President Harris, right now you'd be hearing a lot from labor and a lot from the environmental community about a lot from the energy sector also, by the way, in addition to a fight over digital, about all the things that were wrong with USMCA 1.0 and how great it is that we have the review period. So the way I would describe it, it gives President Trump a lot of leverage, which he uses in a particular way, but it is also a reflection of a sea change, again, in the U.S. in particular, sort of post-peak globalization, if you want to call it that American political leaders no longer have as much leeway to do trade policy without public input as they had. I mean, particularly if you think about 1990, Bobby, to go back to your opening summary, which was maybe the height of presidential power on this point. And the review process is a way of reassuring your various political constituencies that they'll be able to come back and have another bite if they want, for better and worse.
Great. So following up on that idea of these political constituencies, I wanted to ask a broader sense of what issues are at stake, who's implicated in this agreement. So looking at the U.S. side on the notice and comments, you see a lot of industry attention to how the USMCA could help maintain, insulate the supply chains from interference from China. They see how they also talk a lot about the uncertainty associated with the trade agreement. And they also talk about some of these other issues like environmental concerns or labor concerns. But I wanted to ask the other panelists what issues or who you see as having a stake in these negotiations. So Orlando, from the perspective of your understanding of what the other perspectives are on this issue, who do you see as having a stake in it?
To be honest, I think, first of all, I fully agree of what Heather has mentioned and also Eric about the rationale behind this exercise of review the agreement. No, but what the issues are I think, relevant. I think that every single country or member of the USMCA, TEMEC or CUSMA, I think that they have their own reality vis-a-vis the relationship between the three of us. So in the case, perhaps for Mexico, I think that what the elements that are part of that discussion has been fully informed by the media or by some reports that has been published by the government of the US. So they have this foreign trade barriers report. These elements that appear in that report explains what are the main issues that the US has some concern about Mexico's policies. In fact, Canada also shares some part of these concerns, including energy reforms or restriction to corn products that are based on GMOs, or changes in constitutional or previous constitutional organisms in Mexico, or issues related to lack of full enforcement of intellectual property rights. So all these elements are part of that review. So in some way, all these elements are covered in the agreement, but are now part of the irritants that Mexico is trying to fix with the US in terms to continue this relationship. I think that in Mexico industry, the government of Mexico knows the value of the agreement. And I think that wants to play the role of a reliable partner with the US and Canada. So I think that the government has been very clever to not engage in battles on Twitter or battles to respond this in a very offensive way. And they have been doing their work to maintain the conversation, to try to do some issues internally. But many of these issues are part from the first round of the review of the NAFTA, no? And or that has not been able, Mexico, to fully comply with some of the provisions. Right. And I guess that from Canada perspective is the same. They have their bilateral issues with the US, softwood lumber or digital tax, or many other issues that are part of this review. So I think that every single member of the USMCA has their own agenda to cover, but at the same time, the three governments and the industries from the three governments recognize the value of the agreement. And this has become a kind of a very difficult exercise because nothing is, you should not take anything for granted. Sometimes you think that you are doing the work and the next day appears this tweet that says, oh, Canada and the US has...
speaking of these Twitter battles, from the Canadian perspective, it doesn't seem like it's as much continuity as the constant, like the trade-specific issues that arose from the first NAFTA in terms of the bilateral relationship.
So let's be clear. Canada's number one objective in this negotiation is to change as little as possible. And its related objective is to find a way to put some institutional architecture around the provisions that the President of the United States will respect. And so there is a sense of concern, particularly stemming from how the bilateral processes have evolved and an evolving series of requests and demands, that even if you reach an agreement, will it actually be respected? And so that's something which is, I think, enormously important. But to go to the question of why USMCA matters, why it matters first and foremost is this region, and Canada and Mexico particularly, are the only countries on planet Earth that have effectively duty-free access into the U.S., putting aside the Section 232 special provisions. And so we have to find a way to make sure that we continue to have that. If you look at what Europe and Japan agreed to, they're extraordinarily unequal. The United States charges 15% on imports from the European Union, and the European Union charges 0. That will simply not work in North America, given the structure of our economies, given the fact that it's a bridge which separates Windsor and Detroit and Nuevo Laredo and Laredo. And so we have to find a way to do something that nobody else has been able to do. And this is why I think Mark Carney deserves some patience in that he is trying to do the hardest agreement that you can do, which is negotiate with somebody who has gotten the great trading powers of the world, such as Japan and Europe, to agree to hugely unequal agreements. And so this is what's at stake here, and the complexities are so much greater than perhaps they would have been in the past.
Would you like to follow up on that?
Yeah, I think the things I would add to what has already been said is that particularly for this U.S. administration, the stakes here are not just the economic stakes, although those are big enough in the ways that you laid them out. But this North American relationship has always been a mix of trade and security, if we're honest, particularly with our Mexican colleagues. But we've now flipped it on its head. And so this administration sees trade as a price to be paid for security rather than the reverse, as maybe past administrations have seen it. And President Trump has very successfully now, since he first came down the golden staircase, used trade as a shorthand in American domestic political life for a referendum on how you feel about U.S. connections with the rest of the world. And notwithstanding that Canada and Mexico are right here, and notwithstanding that our economies are so incredibly intertwined, the president has very effectively been able to use, and playing on resentments that existed going back to NAFTA, frankly, has been able to play on this notion of foreignness. And so that's also at stake, and that adds, frankly, an extra layer of complexity to where the businesses involved now may see North America as one integrated economic space, but it's become clear that a non-trivial percentage of the American population does not see it that way. And so that is another debate that we're going to play out again next year. And it's the last thing that I actually want to mention, because it circles back to the first thing Orlando said. There is a set of thinkers within this administration that see the opportunity to negotiate USMCA as a way to create a new foundation for what global trade looks like, and to create a new set of provisions around relations with China, around so-called rules of origin, which is how much of a product can come from what place, around quote-unquote reciprocity, and then use that as a template. And as you said, look out to our allies and say, okay, you want lower than 15%, then you have to accept what Canada and Mexico have just accepted. And so that actually creates global stakes for what we're about to do.
So one of the striking things about the sort of provisions that they're talking about in this review to govern these supply chains is it's going to require a sense of traceability that currently does not exist in global trade. And this can create all sorts of additional barriers to trade as well. So there's the policy uncertainty as a barrier to trade, but then there's the sort of regulatory barriers to trade. So how do you see opportunities or challenges in incorporating some of these concerns about making sure that Chinese goods aren't being transshipped from Mexico into the United States, taking advantage of the low tariff, but then selling out the industries not to our partners in Mexico, but rather to China itself? How do you see the ability to trace these products? Do you see innovations that you can imagine adopting as part of this review?
There has been a lot of sometimes discussion in some specific sectors to make this traceability of the inputs, including using technology to fully confirm that all the parts or the inputs that you incorporate in a final good are really from the region. But I assume that it's an issue of cost from the industries and adaptation and the reality, because Mexico, US, and Canada has trade with China and will have trade with China perhaps in some goods that or inputs that they need. So I think that the three governments or the three parties of the USMCA needs to get a balanced approach on which elements they are able to open to outside inputs from outside the region, and which other inputs are able to really build inside the region. And this depends basically on the industry's needs, the needs from this type of inputs. And I think that the other element that I want to comment is that from the regulatory perspective, or the other relevant part of the agreement, I think in the case of Mexico, the agreement serves as a counterbalance also, because many of these provisions in some way prevent to adopt other national provisions that perhaps will affect the relationship that Mexico has with US or with Canada. And I think that this is one of the major counterbalance that Mexico has. In fact, is what you see in the newspaper, no? That says, well, the industries mentioned these concerns about the judicial power or many other aspects, no? That perhaps aren't, if you made a fully analysis or legal analysis, perhaps there is no many issues that you really need to concern, but in some way it creates this counterbalance. So the government is able to not create new policies that create more problems inside the region. And I think that this is also one of the issues that we need to consider during this process of review. No?
So how do you see this working in a world in which things like the investor state dispute settlement has been abandoned? What sort of provisions could enable this sort of facilitating institutional development or substituting for institutional development when there are these challenges?
Yeah, just want to add first on the last piece. So technology is making great strides. There are better mechanisms than we've ever seen around traceability. The reality is that there are vendors in China who will do origin fraud for you. You know, you literally call them up and say, hey, you made this in some factory in China or even in North Korea, and they'll put a made in South Korea logo or whatever you want on it. So there are a lot of people who are trying not to be found, who are good at hiding. But that said, Canada, for its part, has invested heavily in trying to identify and thwart transshipment. So this has become a major national priority because it is known that this is what could undermine the relationship with the United States. And so I think first on the institutional piece, first and foremost, you need to show that the agreement is working and that we're not having non-regional content where we shouldn't have non-regional content. The investor state dispute settlement piece is not something that the U.S. will come back to because the government of the United States fundamentally does not want private companies suing them for things that could happen, and there are very clear and understandable reasons why that would be the case. Ultimately, what we will look at, though, is a commitment from the president who has remade the agreement to respect the terms. And there's not really any institutional or legal structure that you can put around that. It has to be something where there are norms. I mean, the things, if we've learned anything in the last few years about institutions, fundamentally, we rely on norms much more than we have thought in the past. And so we need to have some norms that are accepted by the U.S. administration in accepting the results of an agreement struck.
Right. So I wanted to ask Heather to comment on the efforts that may have been happening on improving traceability, in a world of a de minimis requirement. It seems like a lot of goods were just flooding into the United States that were not being evaluated at all. And now that there's a change in the rules, so we're going to ask the post office, I think, to check everything. It seems like we don't have the resources to actually do that. How do we think about what previous administrations were accepting for so many years?
So I will say it was shocking at the beginning of the Biden administration, and frankly, in the run-up to the Biden administration, when I was part of conversations about what some of these supply chain efforts were going to look like. It was shocking to discover how little due diligence the global corporate sector had put into where it was getting its stuff and how its stuff was being made and by whom. Again, we were really taken aback, and so I agree with Eric that there's been huge, actually, progress over the last 4 or 5 years, spurred by COVID and spurred by concerns around forced labor, and then spurred by the desire to disentangle some of the China supply relationships. So you really have to look at all three of those, corporate social responsibility as well. So we've made a lot of progress. And having said that, it was also clear at the end of the Biden administration, when we were thinking about how to deal with the de minimis loophole, it was clear under the Biden administration that Congress had not given us and was not going to give us the resources you would need for Customs to be able to track packages. And that was before Customs and Border Patrol all got removed from the business of checking packages and put in the business of deporting people. So it's very, very unclear to me how practically we're going to do this in the near to medium term. It's not that it's not doable, but it is, I mean, and Eric's right that there's a lot of technology and we're in a better place than we were, but it brings up something that I think is important because it goes to your point about commitments, that there is the level of demonstrative public wins, and then there's the level of what's actually happening. And I sometimes think that it is more important to this administration to get something it can claim as a public win on some of these than it is to have an actually well-running system. So that's my kind of cynical insider view of where we are.
So we do see that, did you want to follow up on that before we continue?
I just want to say that the de minimis piece is a classic example that the problem is China and North America is getting hurt. And so North America is different. So somebody sending a package from Canada Post to the United States is not the issue. It's Temu and Shein. If you look at the 1.3 billion small packages that U.S. Customs processed in 2023, an estimated 1/3 were from those two companies. And so I think, the problem is that the U.S. approach is really to punish everyone instead of looking at where the issues are. I mean, because the allies, they want to help. They want good relationships. They want constructive relationships. But there are people who won't ship to the U.S. from Canada anymore. There are, it's been reported that FedEx is throwing packages overboard that are coming from the U.K. Yeah. London is not the problem. It's Shenzhen.
Yeah. So in that world where packages are being tossed overboard, which, the trade economics in me is like, that's what a tariff does, is it throws a few packages overboard, about 15% or 20%, depending on what the tax is. But in that world in which that's happening, you might have imagined that there would be a big counter push by, let's say, the major corporations that we think are politically powerful in all three of these countries. And while there's been definitely a consensus in two of them, we have not seen a loud voice on part of the business community on this issue. And I was wondering, what's going on here? Why is it that the investor class has been so passive? Why is it that, I guess today the stock market took a little dive because people are realizing AI might not work out for everyone. But what's going on? How do you interpret that?
Yeah, so I'll start with that one, because I think the perspective from the US is really quite different than from any other country in the world. And because we are an enormous continental economy, and we are in some ways quite insulated that for our big companies, or for many of our big companies, trade is not as important as it is for a Mexico or a Canada or many of our smaller European allies, or frankly, for an economy the way it's taught in your average, the trade economics that our viewers might have taken in college or grad school. So if you are a CEO, it may very well make sense for you to say, okay, we're going to lose some money in efficiency on the trade side. We're going to throw some packages overboard, to your point, but we're going to make so much money by the lowering of our corporate tax rates that, you know what, that's a good deal for us. And my interpretation is there's some of that. There's also, we've seen when consumer-facing corporations have spoken up and said, hey, consumers, we're going to be raising your prices because that's what tariffs do. You've seen the pushback from the White House. So I think there's also a certain chilling effect going on as well.
Comments?
I fully agree, but obviously what happened in the case of Mexico, as mentioned by Heather, is quite the opposite. Obviously, the industries and the big companies are pushing to maintain the agreement. So probably at this stage, everybody knows, or they talk in corridors, that probably next year in July, the 3 USMCA countries make some progress in the review, but perhaps they will not be able to extend or to agree in writing that they are able to extend the agreement for other 16 years. But everybody in Mexico is trying to push that the effort that the government needs to take and the effort that the industries are taking is to maintain the agreement alive. And I want to touch another aspect that you mentioned that is also related to the dispute settlement mechanism on the investor state, or why the investor class are not very active. But I think that one of the benefits of the agreement is to have this institutional framework. I saw, for example, the agreements with Malaysia and Cambodia. They don't have any proceeding to dispute settlement. It's only consultation, and that's it. And one of the elements that we win during the past years is to have this mechanism. Perhaps there are some issues there that needs to be fixed in terms of timing, or sometimes some decisions, or for whatever reason. But you put in the problem for analysis or assessment from an independent body that can help to alleviate the tension or to try to settle those claims. And I think that the investor state, I understand the reason why there is some idea that perhaps is not, that the US administration doesn't want to continue using or maintaining this type of mechanism in the treaty. But let's be fair, Mexico and Canada has been the main targets about this provision, but at the same time gives US investors or Canadian investors or Mexican investors the possibility to initiate a claim when perhaps the judicial system is not working, or is a different tool that they have in order to settle a problem. And I think that is relevant to continue having this type of institutions.
I'd say the Canadian private sector is united on two things. One, a desire to see the continuation of this agreement. And there have been countless missions to Washington to talk to people. But the reality is that despite the US Constitution, Congress has never been less engaged in the shaping of trade policy. And so there is an audience of one that it comes down to. And the other thing that the Canadian private sector is united on is the need to trade more with the rest of the world. And this is an absolutely rational response to try to deconcentrate Canada's trade with the United States. And I think fundamentally, as we look at USMCA renewal, we want to ask ourselves the question of why is it that we don't want to trade more with our continental friends and allies, particularly given that they are very willing to work with the U.S. on its concerns, to understand what the U.S. perspective is. But they also have politics, and they also have interests, and there's some things you can't fix. I mean, the first U.S. tariff on Canadian softwood lumber goes back to the George Washington administration, not the George W. Bush administration, 1789. And so, but there is an opportunity to do more here, but the logical response is that we will have less North America, not more.
Do you see that as a bipartisan concern that, or non-part? Do you see that as something that, let's say, a Democratic president would be concerned about? The fact that North America's are the strongest allies that the U.S. has in the region are drifting off to other nations?
I mean, the interesting thing about trade is that it divides both parties, right?
Yeah.
So it's hard for me to imagine any Democratic president that would feel comfortable with the treatment of our two continental allies, right? So at a minimal level of how do you treat your closest partners? There are definitely forces in the Democratic Party as well as the Republican Party that are comfortable with this idea that somehow the U.S. market, access to the U.S. market is a privilege and we should be getting more for it. That's a cross-partisan sentiment. So do Democrats and some Republicans dislike the distancing that you're describing and the reasons behind it? Yes, absolutely. Would there still be lots of trade tensions if we had a Democratic president or if we had a different Republican president? Would this review still be difficult? Yes, it would.
Yeah. So I think this is a question about, the different political coalitions that are going on within these countries. It's also a question about big picture, the role of Congress and whether Congress has a role in foreign policy. I think or in particular, whether Congress has Article 1 obligations to set taxes. That remains, I guess, an open question. So the USMCA, as was mentioned earlier, is only one of a number of trade agreements that the U.S. is negotiating with other countries, that Canada is negotiating with other countries, and that Mexico may be negotiating. You said something about trying to find new partners. Do you think that'll take the form of an actual agreement on the part of Mexico or Canada with other countries?
Yes.
The TPP, but with China or something? Or
So-
RCEP maybe?
So Canada is the only G7 country with free trade agreements with every other G7 country.
Mm-hmm.
And so you already have the agreements with Europe, you have the agreements with Japan through the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. A big emphasis now is on a desire to use the trade agreements more. There's a great deal of focus on different types of innovative export strategies. And, but the reality is these things are hard and they take a long time. But what you're seeing from this period, really a profound reshaping of the world economy, is that certain things that Canada perhaps should have done in the past, such as spend more on defense, given the evolving environment, the Trump administration has prevailed on Canada, like allies in Europe, to do that. The move to trade more and use trade agreements with other countries, particularly in things like energy, that has evolved in ways where Canada is using its natural advantages in ways that it really should have. Because North America was an arrangement which worked for a lot of people. It was a efficient, seamless, integrated system, and of course there were problems. But we're moving away from that. And so we're going to have to figure out how to do other things. And, this is a nonlinear process, but it'll get there.
Right.
I think that I have heard from the last 20 years this idea to diversify our exports. The reality is that Mexico's exports, 80% goes to the U.S. The ties with Canada now are bigger, but in terms of number, is not. We are not yet there, no, in terms of the volume of trade. And Mexico has more than 20 agreements with more than 40 countries or 50 countries. But the reality of the industries is when your client number one, and you rely on that client number one and creates all this uncertainty, you want to maintain that your client, no? And probably you need to think, how is the best way to use those other FTAs? No, there was this huge a moment where everybody thought that the TPP will be one of the greatest agreement, and I think that is a great agreement in terms of provisions. But in terms of the trade, the preferential trade that goes through this agreement, perhaps you will see that it's not what we thought. I have not seen the numbers, but so I want to apologize. I have not seen the numbers, but it seems to me that at least in the bilateral trade of Mexico, North America region represents more than 80%.
Great. All right, so we have now time for a Q&A from the audience. If you would please raise your hand and a microphone will be brought to you. Start from right there. We get here.
Yeah, thank you guys for a great panel. Super interesting. And Eric, I believe you touched on a little bit the importance of having this duty-free importation into the United States. And I guess my question is, what role the USMCA can play in that moving forward, simply because right now we have the Supreme Court deciding the president's role in applying YEPA tariffs unilaterally, right, without the approval of Congress. And there are arguments that even if that gets shut down, he also has other tools in the 301 and the 232, which are not covered by the USMCA as far as my understanding. And with that, what is the likelihood of the USMCA almost playing a lesser role because less products will be covered because there will still be these 232 or potentially even 301 tariffs on products coming into the US? And what maybe is also the likelihood or even possibility of adding preferential treatment to products that would fall under 232, such as steel and aluminum or upcoming semiconductor products and whatnot?
Yeah, so USMCA is central because, and this was something offered by President Trump himself in March as the trade tensions were really spinning out of control, that said, if you use the USMCA agreement and you qualify, you get in duty-free. And what you saw is a massive surge in utilization of the agreement because it became the only pathway. Now, we shall see what the U.S. Supreme Court says. My general view is that the lawyers won't say free trade, that the problem you will have is that the Trump administration will plan to transition to other mechanisms. But USMCA has been something that has been largely respected and used by many companies and many industries. And when you look at the inflation numbers in the U.S., when you look at the relative concerns about availability of products, the USMCA, I think, should end up being pretty central. I don't see it becoming less central. As for the Section 232 tariffs, this is a different category, and this is something which the Trump administration really has put a lot of emphasis. So I would dearly love to see free trade in automobiles again. I would dearly love to see an elimination of the restraints on steel and aluminum. Watching the administration, I'm not sure that's a place they're prepared to go at the present time. So that's a tomorrow task. The today task is we keep the framework.
That's an after the midterms task.
Thank you for your insights. One big aspect of trade among the three countries in North America that we haven't talked about this evening is the drug trade. The president has used fentanyl as an excuse to propose very high tariffs against Mexico and surprisingly even Canada. The president has also threatened to fight the drug cartels within Mexican soil unilaterally. So what aspect do you think the drug trade will have in negotiations and ultimately any agreements?
Do you want to take that first, or do you want
Well,
me to?
if you allow me, I think that this is the first time that we saw this very blunt relationship to discuss trade issues with security issues in terms of what the U.S. has put forward. Particularly the problems of Mexico in the border, or the efforts that Mexico has taken to secure to secure that these goods does not come out to Mexico. Obviously, it has created a lot of tension, but at the same time has opened the door for this discussion, and it's very rare, I will say, because they start using these tariffs to put pressure on Mexico. And at the same time, in Mexico, I think the discussion splits in two ways. One is dealing by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, dealing with all this issue of security, and with the Ministry of Security coming to Washington to explain what they are doing. But at the same time, the president make a pause with Mexico about this tariff, because they have this list of non-tariff barriers that Mexico were able to lead with those, no, and or try to fix those issues. So I think that the U.S. is winning in some way twice, because they are discussing directly on issues on security with the Mexican government, and at the same time is trying to fix some trade barriers in order to remove the potential impose or the potential increase on tariffs for the IEEPA discussion. So that's the reality, I will say it. I think that Mexico has made a very good work in terms to not politicize all this issue internally, because obviously goes in the sovereign rights of the Mexican government. But at the same time, is what I mentioned. I think that Mexican industry and the government knows the value of the agreement, and they are trying to play this game and try to make some results, but at the same time, maintain everything down the water, I guess. Yeah.
No,
I don't know if you agree.
No, the only thing, I mean, if anything, the U.S. wins a third time, because President Sheinbaum has very adroitly given President Trump a win on these issues repeatedly by really emphasizing having big public fentanyl busts in a way that maybe the Mexican government hadn't before. But the thing about that is that then it sort of sets up a cycle of seeking further such wins. And there are segments of the American public that just feel their communities have been incredibly destroyed by fentanyl, and with a society where we have real difficulty in addressing the deeper root causes, and if you do address them, they don't show results very fast. But if the president of Mexico is willing to go on TV with a pile of drugs, that looks like results really fast. So it becomes irresistible, in my view, to keep tapping and going back to that. So in answer to your question, it's hard for me to see that President Trump doesn't keep pushing that button. I think it's very notable, I'll just say super quickly, being a national security nerd before I was a trade nerd, that there's been talk about military strikes inside Mexico since before the president's inauguration, and they haven't done it. And I think that is partly because of an assessment of just how devastating it would be for many of our shared interests across security and economics. So I'm cautiously optimistic that cooler heads will continue to prevail, but you're right to point it out as a way that trade and security are entwined in a completely unprecedented way.
I would just say that from a Canadian perspective, people are absolutely outraged that, I mean, you have 0.001% of the fentanyl coming into the U.S. coming from Canada. People know that they see this for what it is, which is a justification for an emergency declaration, even if there is no emergency with Canada. But you need to have that to be able to use the so-called IEEPA tariffs, and so people have become deeply frustrated with this. I remember in the first Trump administration when they declared that steel was a threat to national security, and a friend of mine whose son fought shoulder to shoulder with American troops in Afghanistan just about put his head through the wall because of just the profound disrespect. And so this may be a convenient excuse, but the way that it's heard in other jurisdictions and the way that there is just there isn't even a shred of reality in Canada being an issue. I mean, you can always make improvements, but this is not something which bears out in reality.
I think this is an opportunity to try to bring another kind of reality. We have a question from online here about trying to understand this in more material terms. What do the changes to the USMCA, or proposed, I guess, issues that are coming up in the review, mean for the average consumer in the U.S. in particular? Like, what would these
I would
issues
say if
affect?
there's less free trade, stuff's going to get more expensive.
Yeah.
Yep.
And that's really the essence. So the average consumer should want USMCA to survive if they want to pay less for food, if they want to pay less for consumer goods.
I told my students all the time, so imagine that you need to buy a pair of jeans or a shirt that that the price is double because there is no competition, and you always feel that you want to have this pair of shoes or pair of jeans that perhaps are better quality, nice. So I think that the consumers will lose at the end.
Just for fun, sitting up here, I think it's important to make two other arguments that are out there. One is that it's interesting to note that so far, companies have opted not to pass the full freight of tariffs on to the American consumers, which has made it somewhat harder to make that classic economic argument to the American public. We will see what happens over time. But for at least the moment, it sure looks like profit margins were big enough to swallow some of it, which again is a little at variance from the economic story we tell ourselves. The second point, which we all need to get used to making because President Trump has made it very effectively, is to say Americans are willing to sacrifice on the consumer side if the long-term goal is more American jobs. Now, I would make the argument if you actually want more American jobs, you need, as you both have been saying the whole time, you need predictability, you need dependability, and you also need industrial investment and not just tariffs. But we have to recognize that this is the other side of the argument.
Totally agree.
I think we have time for one last question. I think it's related to this question about how consumers are benefiting from it. But I think another important aspect of regional integration is that these other two countries, as we discussed earlier, are much more dependent on the U.S. than the U.S. is of them. But we also benefit from the fact, presumably, that our largest borders are with stable and prosperous countries. So how do you think that that can be incorporated into our decision-making?
So having just quasi-defended, or if not defended, at least put a case out there for what the administration is trying to do, this administration does assume that we can derive all the benefits from the hemispheric relationship while being tougher and less of a good partner. And I think that's 100% wrong, and that it will make us less safe. It will put less richness in our lives. It's already doing things like hurting our tourism industry and other knock-on ways. So, in fact, being a bully may pay in the short term, but it doesn't pay in the long term.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that it's profoundly sad to see the state of the relationship. I mean, I've worked for 20 years to try to build closer ties with the U.S. and Canada and with North America, and you are going to get a situation where countries will drift apart. I think the U.S. benefits enormously by having willing partners. So when you look at the fact that Canada is now spending a lot more on defense, these are dollars which will benefit security North America as China and Russia push more deeply into the North American Arctic, for example. But the worse, the harder the path gets in terms of trade, and the one thing that I think it bears mentioning here is that unlike with the case of Mexico, President Trump spent 6 months repeatedly talking about annexation of Canada. When you try to take somebody else's stuff, somebody else's land, that doesn't go very well, and it doesn't make them feel very good. And so there are political costs to this kind of rhetoric that would be that I think are going to resonate for a long period of time. Canada knows that the U.S. is its most important trading partner, and it knows pragmatically that it needs to have a good relationship. But the one thing that I think I'll leave you with, Robert, on this is that there was a Pew poll that said that 59% of Canadians saw the United States as the greatest threat to Canadian security. That is something that we will need to work very hard to change in the future. Both the underlying reality will have to be there, but the spirit of cooperation, which saw us through a couple of world wars and the Cold War and so on, we're going to have to find a way to rebuild, and it's going to have to be based not only on mutual prosperity, but on mutual respect.
I fully agree. And I think that my last comment, my last comment is that obviously with all this Twitter and media, I think that as a trade nerd, I think that we need to not think with the stomach, no? And just try to be rational at the end, because at the end, I think everything is able to accommodate. And in my past experience, I think U.S. trade officials, Canadian trade officials are very rational, to be honest. And the issue is to discuss these difficult aspects and to avoid the noise of the principles.
Thank you so much. We want to thank our three panelists for an interesting and enlightening discussion about these important issues for international relations and for the lives of the citizens living in these countries. And thank you all for participating.